moment from the past, Ocotlan becomes a Cuauhocelotl. Several warriors with their leader, a 16-year-old youth, came out of the jungle and approached the river. All of them wore simple combat clothes, and, in addition, the young man had a scarlet ribbon tied around his arm. It was decorated with different drawings and a single dot. Ocotlan, this tall young man with highly developed, beautiful musculature, had already captured his first captive in this war and consequently received the military rank of tlatoani. Everyone in his squad was wondering whether Ocotlan would bring this captive as a gift to ticitl at the next festival or retain him as a slave. The warriors stopped at a river, rapidly flowing down from the mountain. The water was no more than 7 or 8 paces wide, but it was very fast. The warriors, armed with spears and macuahuitl, entered the water and began to cross. The current of the cold water was so strong that it literally knocked them off their feet. It occurred to Ocotlan that if the enemies noticed them now, they would be easy prey. Spears thrown from afar by the atlatls, spear throwers, would hit his warriors without a miss. They would not be able to escape or hide under the water either. After crossing the river, the group went deeper into the jungle. The warriors had walked quite a way when the thickets became less frequent. The smell of smoke reached them, and a clearing with people around a campfire appeared ahead. A spit holding a wild piglet was visible above the fire. Ocotlan raised his arm, bent at the elbow, and his squad froze. Looking closely at those sitting in the clearing, Ocotlan realized that these were warriors of the people they were now fighting. The Zapotecs. There were at least twice as many of them as there were warriors in Ocotlan's squad. While waiting for dinner, the Zapotecs talked nonchalantly, and the noise of the rushing and roiling river did not allow them to hear the enemies. The warriors of Ocotlan did not take their eyes off their leader. They clearly did not want to get involved in a battle with such a large detachment. Ocotlan also understood that an open battle would most likely end in their defeat. He raised his half-bent arm again and twirled it in the air, gesturing to retreat. The warriors, crouching to the ground, had already returned to the river when suddenly Ocotlan again raised his arm, bent at the elbow. The squad froze again. Ocotlan turned to the warriors. There was a devious smile on his face. Is he really going to give the signal to attack now? Ocotlan took out a wooden tube a couple of cubits long from behind his back. The warriors also took out their pipes. Ocotlan opened the bag hanging on his hip alongside his knife. There were several darts in the bag. He chose a red-feathered dart and showed it to the warriors. The tip of the dart was smeared with poisons, including the poison of a golden poison frog. This poison was very strong. It was potent enough that just touching the tip of a dart on the frog's back passed the poison to it, and the dart became a formidable weapon. A mixture of the golden frog's poison with other poisons allowed the captor to keep the victim alive and yet temporarily deprive him of mobility. The warriors also took out darts with red feathers. Dividing the detachment into 2 parts, Ocotlan ordered the warriors to take shelter in the thickets along the bank of the cold river. He then covered them with grass and mud, leaving space for the warriors to breathe while they peered from their hiding places, but invisible to those watching from the shore. At the same time, Ocotlan pointed out a sharp turn that the river made far downstream. Then Ocotlan hid his own weapon and went to the clearing. He walked loudly, deliberately stepping on and breaking dry branches and roots. When Ocotlan approached the clearing, the enemies, alarmed by the noise, were already on their feet. He and the Zapotecs were now only 20 paces apart. At the sight of Ocotlan, the Zapotecs grabbed their weapons and rushed at him. Ocotlan raced back toward the river. Remembering where the river began behind the bushes, he ran straight out of the brambles and threw himself into the water. Ocotlan jumped with such strength that the current did not even pull his body downstream, and he safely surfaced at the other shore. The Zapotecs ran up to the river and began to slowly wade through the turbulent stream. When half of the pursuers climbed ashore, and the others were still struggling with the current, Ocotlan's warriors raised their blowguns and began silently shooting poison darts at the enemies still wading through the water. The Zapotecs on shore didn't even see them, as the warriors were shooting behind them. It was impossible to miss from such a close distance. The Zapotecs that had managed to cross the river were already headed deep into the jungle on the other side in the hope of catching Ocotlan, and did not see that their immobilized tribesmen, who could not even call for help, were caught up by the current. Soon, Ocotlan and his warriors regrouped around the bend of the river. They now had 8 bound Zapotec captives in their custody. The captives already had one ear cut off, and Ocotlan's warriors used the blood to make marks on their forearms, where the ribbons were tied. Now, Ocotlan awarded each of his warriors a captive slave, and he himself became a Cuauhocelotl. Chapter 4. The Pyramid. Early in the morning, a column of horsemen, infantrymen, archers, and their commanders, numbering more than 150, left the fortress of Leiria and headed for the seashore. The soldiers shivered from the morning chill, which was intensified by their iron helmets and armor. At the head of the company rode the castellan himself with his deputy. Don Daniel was to command the exercises, which he regularly conducted in the fields, then in the woods, and finally on the seashore. The castellan was gloomy. Although his wife cooked him breakfast and made the sign of the cross to protect him on the road, Estella, despite her mother's urging, did not want to get up at such an early hour and kiss her father, and that saddened him greatly. The column had to traverse the 5 leagues separating the fortress from the sea and settle down on the shore. On the second day, the soldiers had to repel an imaginary landing of the Moors from 10 ships at once. The distance to the sea was short. Moving at an average pace, according to Daniel's calculations, they should have reached the shore in half a day. However, delays immediately began along the way. One of the soldiers had a cold, and 6 horses limped and had to be reshod right away. And where there was work, of course, there must be time set aside for lunch, which also required gathering firewood for a fire and cooking. It was already evening when the company, having finished with half of a small supply of provisions, felt the sea wind. A sprawling but low hillock appeared ahead. It was the Hill of the Big Turtle. The hill got its name from the volcanic rock along the shore. The black stones approaching the water were licked by the sea, carving crevices and contours resembling a turtle shell. To the right of the hill was a dark forest. A road crawled out of it that went along the shore and then followed the entire coast of Portugal. This was one of the main land routes between the cities of the kingdom.
Ricardo!
Daniel shouted to the orderly.
I'm here, Senor Castellan.
Send a messenger to the fortress that we are camping at the Big Turtle on the lands of Don Leandro of the Center Estate. Have them send provisions here for 3 days.
Half an hour later, Daniel was already giving orders to his sergeants, and they were running away to command the soldiers. Infantrymen, cavalrymen, and archers were setting up tents while cook chiefs were making fires. Chains of soldiers with buckets created a line to a barely noticeable small river that came out of the forest and then was lost into the fields. Pairs of guards were assigned to 2 shifts. The first guard was to guard the camp, and the second was to patrol the road. Sergeants checked the soldiers' weapons and armor until dark. Someone was ordered to sharpen arrows, swords, and spears again, and check the serviceability of halberds, crossbows, and arquebus. Someone had to sew up torn clothes and mend boots. The cavalrymen fed the horses and checked their equipment. Some cut grass, which was then left for the hobbled horses. Since an attack had to be expected at any moment, it was impossible to let the horses graze freely. Don Daniel sat in the tent playing dice with his deputy, whose eyes blinked shut with fatigue. There were mugs and a jug of wine on the camp table. Don Daniel strictly ensured that only sergeants drank wine, and even they did not drink more than one mug. Finally, the camp quieted down. Soon, 2 soldiers in armor and semicircular helmets with wide brims came out on the big turtle hill. They stopped at the edge of the cliff to relieve themselves.
"Well, Pedro,"
said one to the other,
"they say Cristiano of the cavalry was killed on this hill, and Jose, who was with him, either escaped, or drowned, or something. Have you heard?"
"Who hasn't heard?"
Pedro replied.
"And they also say that the Red Ghost showed up. Cristiano is dead, and Jose apparently is so scared that he still hasn't stopped running. He's probably already reached Castile. The cavalry are always cowards compared to the infantry. All their courage is in their horses, and even those limp."
"Look!"
his partner shouted.
"What is that?"
Pedro raised his head. The sky in the west lit up with a red light, as if a huge bonfire was blazing somewhere beyond the horizon. "A fire in the sea?"
"What is it?"
Pedro muttered.
"Sunset?"
"It cannot be the sunset. It's been completely dark for already half of the patrol's shift. Santa Maria!"
Coatl stood at the top of a regular quadrangular pyramid. It was a steep pyramid, and each step required a sweeping step up. A separate staircase with smaller steps led to the place where Coatl was standing, and then it passed through the middle of the pyramid. On Coatl's head sat a huge, incredibly opulent headdress of long black, white, and scarlet feathers. The feathers radiated from the headpiece, which was topped with a human skull. The shoulders, back, and chest of the priest were covered with a ritual cape made of leather and precious stones. On each step of the pyramid there were ceramic pots with fires inside. In addition, each step was decorated with massive drawings, ornaments, and signs. On the lower steps, at the foot of the pyramid, a throng of people dressed in festive attire was crowded around. Ordinary warriors wore simple clothes, but the bodies of the jaguar warriors were wrapped in the skins of predators, and the heads of the eagle warriors were decorated with their feathered headdresses. Some of the others in simple clothes also wore bright headdresses with 2 rows of long feathers. Music was resounding. Someone was banging drums, rattles were echoing in time, and a bamboo flute was shrilly warbling in the hands of a flutist. Women and young people danced rhythmically to their sounds. Some stretched out their hands toward the top of the pyramid. There was an Cihuacoatl, a sacrificial table, in front of the entrance to the room in the small temple on the pyramid. It was in front of this that Coatl stood motionless. After surveying the crowd below, he raised his head and shouted into the sky,
"We welcome Tezcatlipoca. This month we have prepared a good treat. We grant you the Ickahuipilli. It will be the Metzli Pan Tlaluacatli, a white man from a far country across the sea."
At this, Coatl pointed to the room behind him. 2 warriors, a jaguar and an eagle, led the captured soldier to the landing in front of the temple. His body was covered with blue paint. The soldier was so drunk that he could barely stand on his feet.
"Take our Ickahuipilli, Metzli, full of tart drinks and food.
The crowd shouted together,
And let's remember this first ticitl in our city of Tlaluacatli near Ocotlan."
The warriors laid the soldier on his back on the wooden altar and, without letting him out of their hands, stood to the sides. Coatl picked up a ritual knife and raised it over the soldier. The musicians stopped playing. Silence resounded, broken only by the cries of seagulls. Coatl plunged the knife into the soldier's chest, and he let out a shrill scream. Coatl cut open his chest, and the warriors began to break his rib bones. Coatl took the heart out of the soldier's body, continued to beat. The back of the soldier's head fell onto the table, streams of blood flowing from his body. Coatl raised the heart at arm's length. The crowd roared with delight. The music started again, and the crowd began to dance with renewed vigor. Coatl took a ritual axe by its patterned handle, a short weapon bristling with obsidian plates, and decapitated the lifeless body with one blow. Then, with skillful movements, the priest removed the scalp from the head and placed the bloody skull on the tzimtli, a stand for skulls at the entrance to the room. Stepping up to the headless body again, he began to scoop up the blood that was dripping from the wooden altar and smear it on his face, arms, and legs. Finally, he stepped back and raised his hands to the sky. The priest's assistants grabbed the headless body and threw it on the side steps of the pyramid. The body rolled down. Falling from the last step, it hit a seagull and, flying off the stern, finally fell toward the sea, tumbling through the air for several more seconds with the last beats of the cut-out heart. The seagull took off and flew away. From the height of her flight, one could see a pyramid on the deck of a giant ship, motionless on the ocean, made up of two hulls covered by a common deck. There were huge spaces on the sides of the pyramid and on the stern of each of the twin hulls. Through them, daylight or moonlight would fall inside the ship. Next to these giant spaces were wooden panels, which could be used to cover these spaces in case of bad weather. The pyramid stood near the double stern of the ship and directly on its axis. Apart from the pyramid and the platform in front of it, there was nothing else on the stern. The spaces for the light were connected by a path along which inhabitants of Tlaluacatli could reach the panels to cover openings. The entire ship was covered with several layers of bright red, almost orange sealant made of rubber. In the light of the fires that sometimes illuminated the pyramid at night, the ship, from afar, looked like a bright red rock between the water and the sky. Still holding out his hands to the sky, Coatl shouted,
Inenmoikpa, ticitl. This is for you, ticitl.
Tuin Mitsika, we are with you, the crowd shouted back. Coatl descended from the pyramid. On the deck, people gave way to him without ceasing their dancing. Moving away from the pyramid a few steps, Coatl entered another staircase that led downward. Below the deck, along the hulls, there were wide docks, nearly touching the water that created berths for boats. Heavy ropes that hung from overhead swayed slightly, brushing the edges of the piers. The moored boats, floating just below, were empty. However, there were many warriors standing on the docks. They wore combat attire, and their bodies were covered with not only tattoos but also bizarre painted patterns. The jaguar warriors held macuahuitl and shields in their hands, and the eagle warriors were armed with bows and atlatls. The warriors looked at the bloody Coatl with delight.
Aslan warriors,
Coatl shouted, raising his hands again.
Sons of the sun! We are going to meet Huitzilopochtli.
Tuin Mitsika.
The crowd of warriors roared.
Sia! Go!
Coatl ordered as he took off the skull and feathered headdress and put on his jaguar battle helmet. Then he grabbed the rope hanging over the boat, and swinging from it, he flew onto the bow. His warriors followed his example. Each boat could accommodate 10 people, and as the boats filled, those remaining on the dock hauled the ends of the freed ropes up onto the ship. Ocotlan got into the same boat as Coatl. On his hands, Ocotlan wore combat gloves armored with 3 short obsidian blades. He wore a yellow Ichkahuipilli, the color indicating his rank and position. Shorn one's tlacochcalcatl. He also sported a quauchic hairstyle, a narrow strip of short-cropped hair running through the middle of his shaved skull. The companions of Ocotlan and Coatl were comprised of eagle warriors. Tupac got into another boat. The face of Tupac was covered with yellow and blue paints, and he was dressed in a gray Ichkahuipilli, the outfit of several otomies who sailed on this ship. He commanded the squad that included all the jaguar warriors. The boats began to float out from under the deck of the giant ship, the size of a town, called Tlaluacatli. The people who continued to dance on the platform in front of the pyramid let out cheers and waved their hands at the sight of the boats. The musicians came to the edge of the deck, where they dramatically accelerated the rhythm of the melody and crescendoed their sounds to near deafening. Chimalli and his daughter Anacaona were sitting in one of the boats. The ticitl wore a long, ankle-length red dress, but Anacaona dressed much more modestly in a dress made of simple linen, decorated with embroidery, and belted with a simple rope. Both, like all Tlaluacatli people, were wearing jewelry made of gold, silver, and precious stones. In the other boat were two of Chimalli's other assistants. In total, 6 boats came out from under the deck of Tlaluacatli into the sea. Inside each of them stretched a rope, evenly covered with knots. Grasping and pulling these knots, the warriors drove the boat forward. In this way, they powered the astern propeller, their efforts transmitted through a special round mechanism with small blades at the ends. The warrior sitting at the stern of the boat had his hands on the helm. The engine was so simple that it practically could not fail, and yet there were oars inside the boats. They could be used if the rope broke or if it was necessary to sail without noise. The boats were rushing forward. From the body of Coatl, washed by splashes of seawater, the blood of the Ichkahuipilli flowed to the bottom of the boat. Anacaona waited with bated breath for a meeting with new Tito, a new land, and new people. The girl's excitement was great. From time to time, she dipped her palm into the water and put it to her forehead. Who knew what awaited them ahead? It wasn't long before the boats landed. The warriors began to jump out of the boats and go ashore.
Get together!
Ocotlan commanded his warriors.
Keep at a distance of 5 steps from each other. Tupac, you're the first!
Ocotlan raised his right hand, tied with a yellow ribbon, and pointed it at the cliff under which the black wall began. Tupac gave the command to his squad of 30 jaguars. After getting out of the boats, they immediately climbed up the cliff and lay down there in the grass, carefully looking around.
Ticitl will stay in the boats. They will be called if anyone is injured.
Ocotlan commanded.
Cihuacoatl, and you, the eagle, Cihuacoatl. You will stay here and guard the boats with the ticitl, and you, ticitl, do not dare to leave from here.
At the menacing look of Ocotlan, Chimalli shivered. Ocotlan raised his hand with the scarlet ribbon. The eagle warriors, occupying 2 boats, rushed to the cliff. Coatl followed Ocotlan. Anacaona really wanted to go ashore and see where the warriors had gone.
Freeze and don't move.
Chimalli whispered to her. It suddenly occurred to Anacaona that for every opportunity in life, the first time could also possibly be the last. Who could know? Perhaps the warriors would return from the shore, climb in their boats and sail back, and she would have seen nothing of this new land. She could be on the precipice of the most important event of her life, and to experience it, she needed to act. Soon, Anacaona noticed that Chimalli, who had been fidgeting on the bench, squinted and stared fixedly at the top of the cliff the warriors had climbed. The jaguar and eagle did not take their eyes off the black wall either, and also carefully watched the sides of the shore. It was quiet. Anacaona heard only the whisper of the waves rolling on the night shore. After waiting for some more time to be sure, Anacaona silently, without splashing, plunged over the side of the boat into the sea and dived deep. Under the water, she swam away from her boat left in the care of the eagle and jaguar. When the suffocation became unbearable, she quietly surfaced and took a deep breath. The warriors and other ticitl should not have noticed her. The boats were already far away, and Anacaona swam away from them toward the shore. Soon the boats were completely hidden behind the crests of small waves. As Anacaona came ashore, a wall of black stone, several times the height of a man, rose up in front of her. Here the shore was no longer stone, but sandy. Anacaona touched the wall. It was the obsidian she knew well, solidified lava. Having bypassed this hillock, Anacaona ran in the opposite direction from the boats, looking for a convenient place to climb. After finding a spot and climbing up, she finally felt the soft ground under her feet. Her sandals sank into grass that tickled her ankles. The smell of fields and forests came from the shore. Anacaona closed her eyes for a moment and began to inhale the air of this plain. This girl had a gift, a special sense of smell, which helped her to recognize the healing qualities of plants. In her head, the smells turned into patterns and colors, and now, new smells were entering her head with amazing shapes and colors that she had never experienced before. All these smells were completely new to her. When her nose stopped eagerly exploring the air of the plain, she opened her eyes again. Lights could be seen in the distance. It seemed that windows were glowing because the lights had a square shape. The bonfires couldn't be square, Anacaona decided. Of course, these are people's homes. Anacaona was scared. Are these the servants of Huitzilopochtli? Who would know how they would meet her? Anacaona looked around, hoping to see the boats, but she couldn't see anything in the dark.
Don't be afraid.
Anacaona ordered herself,
I need to find out who lives here.
and with that, Anacaona went forward, towards the lights that excited her imagination. Meanwhile, Chimalli, not finding his daughter next to him, was extremely frightened. It was not just that Anacaona violated Ocotlan's order. Anything could have happened to her in this unknown land. Having mastered the art of silently walking, diving, and swimming in his childhood, Chimalli also silently rolled over the stern and began to quietly swim away from the boat. He didn't know that Anacaona had swam in the opposite direction. Dawn was breaking. The warriors of Coatl could already clearly distinguish the tents pitched on the field between the forest and the sea and the houses standing in the distance. People began to come out of the tents. They were soldiers, as their attire clearly indicated.
Coatl,
Said Ocotlan.
these are the same people we met last time. Look, they have the same hats and the same clothes.
Horses appeared in the distance. The soldiers led them to the tall grass clumps that marked the bed of a barely noticeable stream.
And the animals that those two rode are the same.
Ocotlan said.
Who are they?
Coatl asked himself out loud. Ocotlan continued to watch the camp, and soon Tupac crawled up beside them.
There are many of them.
He whispered.
There are at least 5 times 20 of them here. And there are more and more of those scary animals.
And they have the same weapons as those two.
Ocotlan continued.
We'll have to go back. We can't fight them.
We're not going back to Tlaluacatli without more captives.
Coatl said menacingly.
People will not forgive us for an unsuccessful campaign. You know that yourself.
Ocotlan understood perfectly well what the priest was driving at. If they returned without more captives, Coatl's influence would be shaken. Then the worst would happen. People would lose faith in their tlatoani. Ocotlan knew it was better not to disturb Coatl with idle conversations anymore. After all, he was a priest, a judge, and the tlatoani of Tlaluacatli. Ocotlan, the tlacochcalcatl, the chief of the military in this campaign, had to follow the orders of his tlatoani. Coatl needed new captives? Great. Ocotlan's task was becoming clearer than ever. To get more captives like the one who was recently presented to Tezcatlipoca at the top of the pyramid. How should he do it? Attacking them was not an option, so they would have to be lured into a trap and captured so that nothing would be noticed in the camp. Where could this be accomplished? Only in the forest. Fortunately, these soldiers kept running into the forest and back.
Zolan, Ecotli, Util,
Ocotlan commanded, turning to the chiefs of squads.
order your warriors to go down to the shore. Under the cover of the cliff, we will reach the forest and capture as many tlatoani as we can. No one at the camp of these people should notice that we captured their brethren in the forest. We'll take them to Tlaluacatli. Follow me.
Ocotlan crawled back to the shore silently and imperceptibly, never once rising above the grass. The warriors followed him. Once at the shore, below the level of the plain, they straightened up to their full height and ran along the edge of the sea, following their commander. The sun had not yet fully risen when Ocotlan and 36 warriors lay down at the edge of the forest. They stared at the camp and its inhabitants with all their attention. Ocotlan understood that it would not be possible to capture many captives. Soldiers from the camp went to the forest alone. Therefore, it would only be possible to capture 1 or 2, not more. If too many people did not return from the forest, the camp would definitely be alarmed. Well, we'll have to limit ourselves to these.
Ocotlan,
Chief Zolan whispered.
what is that strange sound?
Ocotlan listened. From the direction of the forest road, which his squad had crossed unnoticed, there was a strange creaking sound. He raised his head and then saw a strange structure roll out of the thicket and into the clearing near the exit from the forest, drawn by a huge 4-legged monster, the larger brother of those animals on which the other 2 had been sitting, the Atlatl and his partner. It was a wooden platform, under which 4 wooden discs rotated. There were sacks of some kind on the platforms that the brothers of the monsters were dragging behind them. A tethered bull trotted behind one of the sleds. The team was accompanied by a soldier, Metzli in armor. He had put his helmet on the platform and was now wiping his sweaty forehead with his sleeve. This team was followed by 4 more of the same. At Ocotlan's command, his warriors got close to the road. After waiting for the teams to catch up with them, Ocotlan sounded a signal call. Eagles immediately fell from the trees onto the teams. Making giant leaps, jaguars silently jumped out from behind the bushes. The soldiers in the wagon train did not have time to react, as their hands and feet were wrapped in ropes or vines, and their mouths were stuffed with lumps of rags. Ignoring the platforms and bags, Ocotlan's warriors dragged the captives into the forest. The capture lasted less than a minute, and all was done. The horses left without their owners, continuing to pull the carts onward, and the bull continued to wave off the gadflies with his tail. Finally, the wagon train crawled out of the forest. Don Daniel was resting on a soft bed in his tent when he heard the orderly whisper,
Your Grace, we have trouble.
What is it?
Daniel woke up instantly.
A supply train has arrived from Leiria, but none of our soldiers are with it. A soldier's helmet was found on one of the carts and nothing else.
What the hell? Where are they?
I don't know, Your Grace, but the wagon train is completely untouched.
The supply carts were indeed intact. Even the location of the bags of flour and cereals tied with ropes indicated that none of them were missing, but the wagon train soldiers seemed to have sunk through the ground. Panic seized the camp on the seashore. Who would threaten the soldiers except those damned Moors, who had not been seen here for a long time?
Yes, it can only be the Red Ghost.
The experienced fighters said.
It is his handiwork, or maybe his teeth.
Spewing curses, Daniel ordered a detachment of 36 soldiers to comb the forest, and the cavalry split into 2 groups to inspect the road in both directions. After getting out of the water, Chimalli climbed a hillock. He didn't see any of the warriors at the top. In the distance could be seen tents and figures of people in shiny armor, who scurried between them. To the left, the forest approached the camp, and Chimalli realized that his tribesmen could only be there. They couldn't hide anywhere else. Crouching down to the grass, Chimalli crept towards the forest. Chimalli was already very close to the thicket when suddenly several four-legged monsters rode out to the edge. On their backs sat men dressed in shiny armor. Their complexions were similar to the pale hue of the metzli.
The red ghost!
One of them exclaimed in horror, pointing at Chimalli.
Hold him!
Another shouted. The horsemen rushed to Chimalli. Dismounting near the terrified ticitl, they knocked him to the ground and began to beat him. The blows were so strong that the ticitl began to lose consciousness.
And you say a ghost? Look how the blood is gushing out of him.
One of the soldiers said. The soldiers tied up Chimalli, put him across the saddle, and drove him to the camp with joyful hooting. Meanwhile, Anacaona was approaching a village that stood far from both the sea and the military camp. The people she saw from afar, even at such a distance, were like the Ichkahuipilli presented to Tezcatlipoca some hours ago. The same white faces and long beards. The women, clothed in unusual dresses, were distinguishable by the same light color faces. Anacaona immediately understood what these people were doing. They were macuahuitl, farmers and herders. Someone, despite the early hour, was already cutting the grass. Some women carried water in strange metal jugs. They drew the water from pits with evenly outlined rims and carried it to their farmsteads. Some fed the birds that scurried under their feet, and a little boy with a twig in his hand was driving birds of a different kind to the meadow. These large birds waddled, pulled up their necks, and babbled in unison. The older boys were driving larger animals, which Anacaona had also never seen before, into the meadow. These animals were docile, moved slowly, chewed grass constantly, and would sometimes moo loudly. On the other side, across the road, girls in odd dresses were spreading long pieces of canvas on the grass. Soon the sounds of hammering and clanging began to sound from the village. An experienced ear would have recognized them as the blows of a blacksmith with his hammer. The noise of looms could be heard through house windows facing the sea, and despite the early hour, this noise was accompanied by a mournful female song. All these unfamiliar sounds to Anacaona both frightened and interested her at the same time. Anacaona decided to get closer to these people and their homes, but suddenly a detachment of military men in shining armor atop four-legged monsters rode out of the forest. They raced along the road that passed through the village. One of these monsters knocked down a little boy but did not stop, even when the boy's roars could be heard by the whole neighborhood. Anacaona was petrified by the horror that these creatures and their behavior instilled in her. Bending down below the grass, she hurried back to the side of the cliff, the top of which was clearly visible against the sky. Descending from the cliff, Anacaona came out on a stone shore, similar to the back of a giant turtle. Searching her memory, she remembered that their warriors disembarked from boats not far from here. However, there were no boats near the shore anymore. Anacaona looked out to sea. Far away, between the crests of the waves, boats disappeared and reappeared, looking like seed husks from her place on the shore. The warriors and her father, there could be no doubt about it, were returning to Tlaluacatli. What could Anacaona do? Of course, in no case did she want to catch the eye of those cruel savages whom she had managed to see, so she decided she would have to hide in the forest.